This will be my most philosophical essay so far. It deals with the question, what is the foundation of all morality in the modern world? This we will try to answer by looking at how Ted Bundy justified killing and raping his 30 or so victims. This essay is a sort of response to one of the videos that most changed my way of thinking. It was a 6-year-old 10-minute video by the Schattenmacher, a German YouTube channel that inspired me to begin my own channel. This video asks about the foundation of all morality and begins this difficult inquiry by reading Bundy's rationale for his actions, and then he gives his own conclusion. If you speak German, then I will link the video and recommend that you watch it. But since, I assume, most of you do not speak the German, then the first part of this essay will translate the arguments into English, and in the second part of the essay I will give my own personal interpretation of the Schattenmacher's arguments. Ted Bundy was a serial killer that was guilty for over 30 cases of kidnapping, rape, and murder. This is nothing that would differentiate him from the other serial killers. The main difference was that he was well educated, and the most disturbing part of his character comes in the cold and rational way that he justified his own actions. His rationale is displayed in the following quote. Then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments, and that all value judgments are subjective, and that none of them can be proven to be right or wrong. I even read somewhere that the Chief Justice of the United States had written that the American Constitution expressed nothing more than collective value judgments. Believe it or not, I figure out for myself what apparently the Chief Justice couldn't figure out for himself. That is, that if the rationality of one value judgment was 0, multiplying it by millions would not make it one whit more rational. Nor is there any reason to obey the law for anyone, like myself, who has the boldness and daring, the strength of character, to throw off its shackles. I discovered that to become truly free, truly unfettered, I had to become truly uninhibited. And I quickly discovered that the greatest obstacle to my freedom, the greatest block and limitation to it, consists in the unsupportable value judgment that I was bound to respect the rights of others. I asked myself, who are these others? Other human beings with human rights? Why is it wrong to kill a human animal more than any other animal, a pig or a sheep or a steer? Is your life more worth to you than the hog's life to a hog? Why would I be willing to sacrifice my pleasure for one and not for the other? Surely, you would not in this age of scientific enlightenment declare that God or nature has marked some pleasures as moral or good and others as immoral or bad. In that case, let me assure you, my dear young lady, that there is absolutely no comparison between the pleasure that I might take in eating a ham and the pleasure that I would anticipate in raping and murdering you. This is the honest conclusion to which my education has led me, and after the most conscientious examination of my spontaneous and uninhibited self." End quote. There is a good reason why Bundy introduced himself as "I am the most cold-hearted son of a bitch that you will ever meet." However, the position that Bundy takes is that of a particularly radical form of moral subjectivism. In plain words, this means that he believes that there is no objective standard that we can use to judge right and wrong. Since all judgments are subjective, he has no reason why he should care more about the moral judgments of others than his own. This means that he does not have to obey any law and can do whatever he wants. The thing is that the Schattenmacher agrees with this argument. To translate his words out of German. Quote, "I personally live according to this moral principle. Whatever I want is morally legitimate purely by the fact that I want it, and immoral is everything that I do not want." End quote. He goes further in an even more interesting direction. Quote, "And it gets even better. I assert that every single man lives according to this exact same principle, if it is known to him or not." End quote. To prove his point, he gives us a thought experiment. Let's imagine a person that lives perfectly according to Kant's categorical imperative, the golden rule, or any other moral principle. He accepts this principle to be correct and applies it to all of his actions. Now we must ask ourselves, why does this person decide to live according to the categorical imperative, or any other moral principle for that matter? The Schattenmacher has a long answer and a short one. Quote, "The short answer is because he wants to. The long answer is that he believes that acting in such a way, he will achieve the best possible outcome for himself and the people he is responsible for. This is important to him because he wants the well-being of the people around him, and he wants this because this is what he desires. Behind everything, you will always find desire." End quote. It is interesting to note that such moral subjectivism is, historically speaking, very new. For thousands of years, moral subjectivism was almost unthinkable because each culture had its moral foundations in their religious beliefs. Why is murder and rape wrong? Because God said so. It is written in this book, and everything else is a heresy. But we do not find ourselves in any normal age. We find ourselves in an age where religion is in decline. And Dostoevsky put the consequences of this fact in one very simple phrase. If there is no God, everything is permitted. Without divine authority, all moral claims are made by humans and are therefore not and cannot be absolute. Without God, all moral claims are subjective. Even things like human rights are in the end subjective, because they are still made by men, and the only reason that people pretend that they are absolute is simple dogma. So far, only the point of view of the Schattenmacher, which is probably based on Max Stirner, remains unchallenged. We can be sure that behind individual morality stands individual desire. But I am not satisfied with this because it only explains how morality works at an individual level, but does not give us any principles that we can use to make moral judgments of right and wrong. This conclusion left me with a question. Is there any way that we can find a morality that can overcome moral subjectivism, so that I may objectively call Ted Bundy a degenerate? Here is an overlooked aspect. This argument ignores the difference in quality between two individual moralities. Just because all moralities are based on desire does not mean that they are all equally successful. Indeed, it is obvious that some moralities are more successful than others. For example, a society made up of people who think like Ted Bundy would collapse into anarchy. From that point of view, we can say that that society would be unsuccessful. Aha, you say. I am now digging myself into another hole because now I have to define success. And that can have a lot of meanings. Do I mean financial success, intellectual success, or what exactly? Well, what is the greatest desire of all living beings? The answer is existence. All living beings desire to exist, and because we are organic beings, existence means survival. If you do not succeed at survival, then all the other types of success are meaningless. We could say that this is too amoral to be a moral standard, but at least what we can say about survival is that it is objective. We might have different opinions about what helps a society to survive, but the results are clear. Either your society survives or it does not. One of the things that becomes clear once you read enough history is that societies are in constant competition with one another and are therefore also locked in a Darwinian struggle. This is not a nice fact. There was nothing nice about the sack of Carthage or the colonization of India, but we need to accept that societies that are weak will in time collapse or be conquered. Therefore, if you want your society to survive, it has to be both resilient and competent. Or to put it in one word, strong. If we can agree on survival being the ultimate good, then we have a very solid ethical yardstick. If survival is the ultimate good, then everything that helps survival is also good, and everything that hinders it is bad. In other words, everything that makes a society stronger is good, and everything that makes it weaker is bad. The other thing about survival is that it cannot be done alone. In one hand, groups are more effective than one very capable person. All that you need to beat Mike Tyson to death are some 10 or 12 guys. So the lone wolf strategy cannot compete against well-organized groups. On the other hand, you are going to die. If a society wants to live longer than 80 years, then it needs to reproduce, and as far as I know, that cannot be done alone. These two factors mean that when we are talking about survival, we have to look at it from a collective point of view, not an individual one. If something is good for the collective, but bad for the individual, like dying in the defense of your country, then the collective good will outweigh the individual good. But although the collective might be more important, at the end of the day, we are still all individuals. So the sum of all the individual actions of the many members of a society is what defines that society. We might say that each individual action that a person makes will make his society either stronger or weaker. In other words, it will be either morally good or bad. Here we will call the traits that make a society stronger virtues, and those that make a society weaker we will call vices. Luckily, most of the things that modern normie morality considers to be good are also things that make your society stronger. Solidarity and generosity with your fellow citizens are virtues. Physical health is a virtue. Discipline is a virtue. Creativity is a virtue. And finally, honesty and loyalty are important virtues. A society that has all of these will not have many problems surviving. Indeed, these virtues almost always lead to a thriving society. Take South Korea as an example. 50 years ago, they were extremely poor. But because their culture had many virtues, they managed to build a thriving country in one generation without natural resources or anything that made South Korea geographically special, but only through their industry. The opposite of a virtue is a vice, which makes the individual and society weaker. Indifference for your countrymen is a vice. Disease is a vice. Laziness is a vice. Inflexibility is a vice. And treachery is maybe the worst vice of all. If we look at the late Roman Empire, we see all of these in spades. The patricians grew fat on their villas while the average person was forced into serfdom. The most competent among them, like Stilgo or Aetius, were stabbed in the back by their own men, and the empire outsourced their fighting to the Germans. Such a weak society was consequently torn apart limb to limb by all their barbaric neighbors, and they deserved it. I believe that the balance of virtues and vices in a society is the most important factor that will decide their future. Another example. The countries of Latin America are not failed states, maybe except Venezuela, but they're not very successful either. This is because they have great virtues, like being very diligent and sociable, but also terrible vices like corruption and a lack of solidarity for one another. This is why most of them exist in a constant state of mediocrity, somewhere between Somalia and Singapore. All societies compete with one another, either directly through war or indirectly through economic and cultural influence. The result of these clashes is that the society with more virtues will triumph. Indeed, you can trace the outcomes of past conflicts on the virtues and vices of the vanquished and the victors. For example, the Roman Republic defeated Carthage because they had more discipline and unity than the Carthaginians. The Romans lost battle after battle against Hannibal, but did not give in. Instead, they raised new legions. Carthage lost the war because they lost the Battle of Zama, and they did not have the same determination as the Romans. So they gave up. After all, they were at heart merchants and not soldiers. After surrendering, they were disarmed, and 50 years later, the Romans came by to genocide them, and that was the end of Carthage. A good example of cultural competition would be the Cold War, where the USA and the USSR could not directly come into conflict, but instead they fought with diplomacy and culture. The result of this indirect conflict was that the leaders of the USSR lost faith in their own system because the USA had more prosperity and better music that came from having more virtues, such as having more innovation and flexibility, while also having less vices, like not sending your best people to Siberia. There are two objections that arise as a response to adopting this Darwinist morality. The first one is that it relies on one dogma, and that is that existence is good. This is an assumption that is not rational, even if the majority believes in it. There is no objective reason why existing would be preferable to not existing, why life is better than death. There are certainly enough people that believe the opposite and commit suicide. This is the only real weakness of this philosophy, but the nice thing about natural selection is that it also resolves this dilemma. The belief that existence is not good will lead to the future non-existence of those who believe in it. The people that believe that existence is not good and that this life is not worth living will commit suicide, or at least they will not reproduce, and as a result they will in time die out. Soon enough, only the people who hold the opinion that existence is good will continue to exist. The second objection would be that this sort of morality would not be universal, that it is inherently tribalistic. If we place the survival of our society as the highest good, then we are acting only in our own interests. If we say that murder is wrong because it harms our society, then that begs the question: is murder still wrong if it does not harm our society? If we accept the Darwinian basis for morality, then we also have to accept that violence that benefits your society is not morally wrong. This would mean, for example, that war can be good for a society as long as you manage to win. For example, it is indisputable that although Bismarck and Genghis Khan were warmongers, they were good for the Germans and Mongols respectively. The arguments against this are that violence against others is not good for one's own well-being, and that most nations overestimate their own capacity to win wars, such as France in the Franco-Prussian War and Germany in World War II. The real benefit of a Darwinist morality is that it is immune to moral subjectivism. This might not seem like much, but in an age where moral subjectivism is gradually eroding all other moralities, it becomes essential. Traditional religious morality has become eroded because of the decline of religion, and in my opinion, this spells out the eventual death of all traditionalist movements that do not go full Amish. Liberal morality has not really been eroded because it was never anything solid. Everybody is for human rights until it is inconvenient. This applies to geopolitics, but also to everyday things. For example, take off your right shoe and see where it was made. Do you think that the conditions in that factory and the wages would be considered dignified? And yet you still bought it, which means you do not really care. Finally, we have the rotting carcass of conservative morality, the sort of morality that used to guide civil society but was not explicitly religious. Things like waiting until marriage, gender roles, or not taking drugs, and the sort of morality that pre-modern society and your grandparents would favor. These are social taboos that have been completely eroded because they have no solid foundations other than social convention, and therefore this sort of morality is especially vulnerable to subjectivism. Let's take the example of drug use. The United States went from stigmatizing marijuana to drug legalization, safe injection sites, and over 100,000 annual overdose deaths in just 60 years. After the collapse of conservative morality, what we have left is moral subjectivism mixed with a few liberal dogmas. This gives rise to the morality that states everybody is free to do whatever they want as long as it does not hurt others. This is the prevailing morality of most Western countries. This sort of morality, however, cannot make any moral judgments beyond being in favor of consumeristic hedonism and against any values that would restrict individual liberty. Finally, we have the moral subjectivism itself as embraced by the Schattenmacher and Bundy. The results of this egoistic morality will depend on the ego that embraces this way of thinking, so we cannot say much more than that. But what is clear to me is that this results in a sort of solipsism that makes it very difficult to form common ideas about right and wrong. This makes a society disunited and weaker than one that can agree on a common morality. In this desert of viable materialistic moralities, the only one that stands is the Darwinian morality, because survival is objective, inherently desirable, and self-affirming. In my opinion, it is the only solid moral foundation that there is left to us who have outlived God.